When the pandemic first hit, a lot of people lost their jobs overnight. They didn't know how they were going to feed their families or pay their bills. Faced with this unprecedented challenge, our government had two options. We could sit back, let Canadians fend for themselves and hope that it would all be over soon, or we could swiftly and substantially choose to support Canadians. We chose to support Canadians. As we measure the cost of helping Canadians, we shouldn't forget that the cost of doing nothing would have been far more to both our health care and our economy. This is not and has not been a time for tightening of belts or for austerity. By building a bridge for Canadians through this crisis, we can and will build a stronger, more resilient Canada. Today, Canada has one of the most ambitious and comprehensive plans to counter the economic impacts of this pandemic. We increased financial support to vulnerable groups like seniors and students. We provided loans to businesses struggling with cash flow, helped employers rehire their employees, and supported those who had lost their jobs. In fact, nearly 11 million Canadians have been supported through the emergency wage subsidy or the CERB. Our government took on debt to reduce the amount that Canadians themselves had to take on. We were able to do this because Canada entered this crisis on strong footing, with a net debt to GDP ratio considerably lower than the rest of the G7. Our government was well positioned to be there for Canadians and lay the groundwork for our economy to bounce back. 4 months later, we've slowed down the progression of the virus significantly, and we're now seeing parts of the economy reopen. And historically low interest rates mean manageable borrowing costs as we continue to invest in Canadians and in the economy. Now, the road to recovery will not be an easy one. Some sectors will bounce back more quickly than others. Some people will be able to find work, but others won't right away. But as we move through into this recovery phase, Canadians can count on us to always be in their corner. We made a very specific and deliberate choice throughout this pandemic to help Canadians, to recognize that overnight people had lost their jobs, people had suddenly found themselves in a precarious situation and needed support. So as a federal government, given the historically low interest rates and the low debt servicing costs that we have, and given our extremely strong fiscal position going in, we decided to take on that debt to prevent Canadians from having to do it. If the federal government hadn't taken on significant debt in order to send money to Canadians to support businesses and households, what would Canadians have done? They would have loaded up their credit cards. They would have scrambled to try and find ways to pay their bills and pay their groceries and figure out how to care for their loved ones. We took on debt so Canadians wouldn't have to. And we can be confident about our position because it worked to reduce the spread of COVID-19, and we now have the spread largely under control, although we need to continue to remain vigilant. We went into this challenge with a far better fiscal position than many of our allies around the world, which allows us to come through it in a very strong way. And we know that by supporting Canadians through this pandemic, we maximize our chances of getting back on our feet as quickly as possible as an economy. I know there are people out there who said we should have done less. But I think that's wrong. Now was a time for the federal government to step up and help Canadians during a historic crisis, and that's exactly what we did. And having done that has allowed us to get the virus more under control and is allowing us to restart the economy in a strong position, unlike many of our other allies. I think there are going to be really important discussions and indeed political debates about that and about what our economy looks like for the coming years in the coming months. But I can tell you that from the very beginning, we focused on helping all Canadians with a particular focus on the most vulnerable Canadians. Canadians who didn't have access to EI and lost their jobs. Canadians who need to rely on shelters, whether it's people fleeing domestic violence, which was increased by the need to stay home, or people who are already living in the streets. We needed to increase our support for food banks. We need to make sure that Indigenous communities that are so vulnerable to health crises because of a lack of health system supports were extra protected. Throughout this pandemic, even as we sent out support to more than 11 million Canadians, we had a specific focus on the most vulnerable, because that's just who we are as Canadians, but also because we know that allowing and encouraging and giving the ability of everyone to participate, of reducing barriers as we move forward, is going to be extremely important. And I look forward to those discussions. Right now, we're still very much focused on helping people through this crisis.